Welcome to the Scars of Heart channel, and invite you to watch our new video featuring our original story. A large number of guests gathered for Tatiana's 50th birthday celebration. She decided to celebrate her anniversary at home, rather than at a cafe or restaurant, because she had recently become averse to formal events. Tanya used to be the life of the party, able to shine with both her wit and her appearance. Over the years, all of that had disappeared. Now Tanya preferred cozy evenings at home to ostentatious parties, even with close friends. Tanya believed that her plump figure and thinning hair weren't conducive to being the center of attention. Of course, birthday girls. Ugh, what a nasty word. She still had to be the star of the evening. But it was one thing to sit at a table in your own living room, and quite another to be ridiculed in the crystal chandeliers of some establishment. Tanya absolutely loved cooking, and it was no problem for her to set the table for as many as 20 people. Moreover, Tanya's husband Andrew was overjoyed when his wife She suggested this option to him. Previously, Andrew had only talked about how much the celebration of this event would cost them. It didn't matter whether it was held in an ordinary cafe or an expensive restaurant. The prices there, even for a simple salad, were as if they had tiny diamonds in it. And Uni's husband was a frugal man and knew how to handle money. True, her friends called Andre greedy, but Tanya usually disagreed with them. Well, her husband doesn't like to spend money on nonsense like expensive bouquets of roses and so on, so Tanya herself doesn't understand the point of buying something that will wither and end up in the trash in a week. Anyway, the celebration was in full swing. The guests seemed happy, and then at some point, the hostess and hostess's 2 phones rang practically simultaneously. Andre picked up the phone first and immediately left the table. Tanya also answered her phone. The number calling her was unfamiliar to the woman, and because of the noise at the table, she almost didn't hear the caller. When Tanya entered the kitchen with the phone in her hand, her husband had already finished his call and was heading back to the living room. "Hello, excuse me, could you repeat what you said?" Tanya said, closing the door behind Andre. "Yes, good afternoon. I'm calling you about an inheritance," said a male voice. "What inheritance?" the woman asked, smiling. She thought the person dialed the wrong number, or someone was trying to play a joke on her. "Tatiana Viktorovna, your father, Viktor Vasilyevich, passed away, and you are his only direct heir." Wait, Tanya gripped the surface of the table with her hand. "Oh, and when did he die?" "A month and a half ago. I had a hard time finding you, but luckily, there's the internet. And who are you?" "My name is Pavel, and Viktor Vasilyevich was my stepfather, albeit unofficially. He and my mother weren't married." "I see. Then you probably know that I haven't seen my father for many years, and it would be strange for me to lay claim to his inheritance. You're more likely his direct heir. That's why you're calling. Do you want me to sign the necessary papers?" "No, Tatiana. I'm not laying claim to Uncle Vitya's inheritance at all. Firstly, I don't need it, and secondly, Uncle Vitya himself asked that his house go to you. Unfortunately, he died suddenly, and I didn't have time to look for you so you could come and say goodbye to him. But the house is rightfully yours, so you can come and inspect your property at any time. Of course, the old house is nothing special, but land is highly valued in our area these days. Pavel, right?" "Yes, you'll have to forgive me. I don't have the time right now. Can I call you back tomorrow?" "Yes, of course. Sorry for disturbing you." "It's okay. And thank you for your concern." Tanya hung up and went out into the hallway. Her husband was standing by the front door, getting ready to go somewhere. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Sonia called. His car broke down on the highway. Asked me to come help. But you've been drinking. How are you going to get there?" "I called a taxi. A tow truck is a must. It'll be more expensive, And what if we managed to fix the car and drive it back together? Tanya looked at her husband with disbelief. The taxi ride out of town had also cost a pretty penny, and it was strange that Andrei had gone for it. Of course, he always helped his younger brother Sasha, who always managed to get into trouble, but only when it didn't involve money. After seeing her husband off, Tanya returned to the guests. For the rest of the evening, she couldn't get that phone conversation out of her head. She felt a strange sadness at the news of her father's death, although it was strange for her to regret not having cared at all these years. In fact, Tanya hadn't even known before that whether her father was alive or not. It so happened that they hadn't seen each other for many years. Tanya's parents divorced when she was still little. Her father moved to a neighboring village, and Tanya never saw him again for the rest of her life. When Tanya graduated from high school, her mother remarried, and they moved to the city to live with her mother's new husband. Her biological father had never shown any interest in her, and Tanya had no desire to see him either. After all, her father had abandoned her mother for another woman. Tanya loved her mother very much and supported her in her resentment towards her father. "Mom, I'll probably go too," her son said, interrupting her thoughts. "I have a busy day tomorrow, and I have to get up early," the young man explained. "Okay, Antosha, of course. Go ahead," Tanya said, looking lovingly at her son. Tatiana was proud of her son. He had been living independently for several years now. He rented and paid for a luxurious apartment in the city center and worked as a programmer at a good company. Only Anton didn't have a girlfriend yet. But Tanya tried not to interfere with that. He would have time to start a family with Antosha. He even said so himself. After Tatiana's son left, the guests also slowly began to go home. And after some time, Tanya was left alone. She washed all the dishes, cleared the table, and began to wait for her husband to return. She couldn't wait to share her news with Andrei about the inherited house. Of course, Andrei would advise her to accept her father's inheritance. It would be foolish to refuse the extra money, and there was nothing wrong with that, since she was, in fact, the only direct heir. But Tanya she needed to hear words of support, otherwise she felt uneasy. It was getting darker outside, and Tatiana lay down. She turned on a movie on her laptop and, without noticing, fell asleep, only to be awakened by the sound of the front door slamming. It was already light outside, and Tanya looked at her watch. "Where have you been?" she asked when her husband entered the bedroom. They spent a long time fiddling with the car, then stalled a few more times on the way to town. "I didn't look at her," Andrei explained, lying down. After a while, he began to snore. Tanya lay there for a while longer, with her eyes open, then got up. It was already morning, and she was terribly upset that her husband had first abandoned her on her birthday, and then not come home at all. The previous day's desire to share the news of the inheritance with Andrei had vanished. Tanya, on the other hand, decided not to tell him anything for now, but to go and see the house herself first. She dialed the number of Pavel, who had called the day before, and arranged a meeting. He invited her to the village the following weekend and gave her the address of the house, which it was supposed to become her property. A week passed, during which Tanya, still resentful of her husband, barely spoke to him. Andrei, too, made no attempt to reconcile with his wife, feeling no guilt. So, Tanya decided to take a regular bus to the village and headed to the bus station early on Saturday morning. She told her husband she was going to visit their son and smiled on the way, feeling a certain schadenfreude at having kept the news of her father's inherited estate a secret. When Tanya left the house, Andrei was quietly eating breakfast in the kitchen, with no plans to go anywhere that day. So, she was very surprised when, upon arriving at the bus station, she saw her husband's car parked near the side of the road. She looked closely at the license plate and, convinced that it was indeed Andre's, stopped nearby, hiding behind the corner of the house. Soon, her husband emerged from the grocery store across the street and headed toward his car. A woman trotted alongside him, and Tanya stared at them wide-eyed. The woman was a stranger. She tried to recall, but couldn't recall ever seeing her. Meanwhile, Tatiana's husband loaded the supermarket bags into the trunk of the car and, opening the front door, sat his companion in. Then, Andre got behind the wheel. And then something completely unimaginable happened. From her seat, Tanya clearly saw her husband lean over and kiss his passenger. Tanya exhaled and clutched her heart. A compassionate old woman with a shopping cart on her back immediately stopped next to her and looked at her intently. "What's wrong, Hart?" she asked. Tanya only shook her head and said nothing. She continued to look toward Andre's car until it pulled out onto the road and disappeared among the other cars. Hunched over, as if a heavy load had been placed on her shoulders, the woman moved toward the bus platform. The bus she needed was already filling up, and Tanya, barely aware of what she was doing, boarded with the other passengers. A young man, seeing her, stood up to give her his seat. For some reason, this gesture of politeness completely threw her off balance. The tracks and literally falling onto the spot, Tanya closed her eyes. She felt so old and unattractive now that she wasn't at all surprised that her husband, apparently, had taken a mistress. And how else could she explain what she had just seen? The bus pulled away. Tanya looked out the window. "Where am I going?" she thought. More precisely, why? What the hell does she need this house and all that inheritance for now? And what should she do now? How should she live on? Divorce Andre. But that's somehow completely stupid at her age. And the reason is ridiculous. So what if he kissed another woman? Tanya didn't want to think about where exactly Andre and his companion were heading now. Something similar had happened before in their family life. Of course, back then Tanya hadn't seen with her own eyes the woman with whom her husband was supposedly cheating on her. But she had suspicions on this matter, and most likely, they were not unfounded. Only Andre denied everything, and she couldn't prove his guilt. And then Tanya's mother, who was still alive then, sternly told her, "Don't do anything stupid, Tanya. When I was young, I lost my temper, drove your father away, and then I've endured it all my life, watching my new husband Arkady pursue other women. How could Uncle Arkady cheat on you?" Tanya was surprised. She always thought her mother and stepfather were in perfect harmony, and there were no disagreements between them. "I have no doubt that he cheated on me, but having been burned once, when jealousy left me alone with a small child in my arms, I became smarter and didn't get to the bottom of it." "How so?" Tanya asked. "Like this?" Her mother answered. "She lived peacefully and lived. And Arkady lived peacefully next to me. He runs off to the left and comes home. That's worldly wisdom, my dear. If you stop looking for a faithful man, you'll live alone your whole life." Tanya then listened to her mother's advice and tried to drown out the voice of her heart screaming in pain. She was 35, and she convinced herself she'd imagined it all. And if she were honest with herself, she spent the rest of her life studiously turning a blind eye to anything that might arouse suspicion of her husband's infidelity. Like the last time, for example, when Andre didn't come home the night before his wife's 50th birthday. Another woman, in her place, she would probably have called her husband's brother and started asking about the details of their late-night rendezvous after the car broke down on the highway, or at least wondered why her husband's clothes remained clean after he helped her brother fix the car, and why even his shoes weren't the least bit dirty from the road dust. But Tanya was used to ignoring such trifles, lest she ruin her own life. That's what she always thought. But what she had witnessed today was no longer trivial, and she couldn't ignore it. A vision of Andre hugging another woman immediately appeared before her mind's eye. While Tanya was pondering all this, The bus had already pulled out of the city, and small copses of trees flashed past the windows, replacing the landscape with modern buildings, consisting mainly of car dealerships and hardware stores. Tanya realized that turning back after getting off the bus at one of the stops was pointless. She will have to somehow pull herself together and still go to this meeting with her father's stepson, Pavel. Although the last thing she wanted right now was to talk to strangers or settle any business. The village where, as Tanya realized, her father had lived his entire life resembled a very charming small town. There were multi-story buildings, grocery supermarkets, and entire streets lined with modern cottages, although the older single-story buildings were still there. Only thanks to their cladding materials did they look as if they were trying to fit in with the modern world around them. Trying to find the street she needed, Tanya gazed with affection at these miniature houses and imagined those who lived in them. And when she got there, she was delighted to see that her father's house resembled the buildings she had just admired. "Like it?" A man approached from behind and stopped next to her. Tanya, still smiling, looked at him and nodded. "It's interesting that even the window frames on the house are still intact, even though the windows are plastic," she said. "Uncle Vitya cut them out himself and wouldn't let us remove them when we were trying to improve the house. Where just now, Tanya, she realized that she was probably talking to the same Pavel she had come to meet. The woman stared at him intently, but after a couple of seconds, she looked away in embarrassment. The man was incredibly similar to her favorite actor. I was helping Uncle Vitya tidy up the house. True, almost 10 years have passed since then, and the house had time to fall into disrepair again. "It looks great," Tanya babbled. "I mean the house. I get it, you're Tatiana, right? I recognized you from the photo posted on your page, and I'm Pavel. Let's get acquainted." Smiling broadly, the man extended his hand to her. Tanya lightly shook his palm and shivered. "Can we go inside?" she asked. "Yes, forgive my inhospitality. I was completely confused when I finally saw you. Let's go." The man opened the gate for Tanya and, letting her go ahead, followed her in. "The house is quite habitable, and we can even have some tea," he said. "For some reason I thought you'd change your mind and not come today. But you're here, and that's good. Why should I change my mind?" Tanya stopped and she turned and looked at her guide. Pavel shrugged. It was just a premonition. Tanya frowned, but said nothing more. They entered the house, and pausing at the threshold, the woman looked around. To her left was the living room, and even standing at the threshold, Tanya could make out numerous bookcases and a large fireplace that took up almost half the wall. At that moment, for the first time, the woman felt an invisible connection with the man who lived here, her father, whom she practically didn't know. "Come in, Tanya. I'll make us some tea right now." Pavel's voice came from behind her. Tanya nodded and hesitantly entered the small room. Her gaze immediately fell on the shelf above the fireplace. Among other things, there were 2 framed photographs. One was taken at sea, and in it Tanya recognized her father, although he looked much older than in the photographs in their old album. A short woman and a young, tanned man stood next to him. Tanya guessed rather than recognized him as Pavel. Her attention was drawn more to the second photograph. It was familiar to her, and it featured herself when she was 4 years old. "Did you put this photo here on purpose?" Tanya asked Pavel as he entered the room, pointing to a childhood photo of herself. The man looked at her in surprise. "It's always been here, ever since the fireplace was installed. Before that, your photo was on the shelf above Uncle Vitya's desk." Tanya looked down. Pavel took teacups from the sideboard and returned to the kitchen. After a while, he brought out a tray with a steaming teapot and cookies in a small vase and set it all down on the round table next to the window. "Sit down. The food is so-so, but I can forgive it. I don't know how to cook anyway, let alone feed you dumplings, which is what I mostly eat myself." The man gave Tatiana his signature smile. The woman pursed her lips and, taking the cup of tea from his hands, sat down on one of the chairs. They were both silent for a while. Tanya stared thoughtfully into space, periodically sipping the fragrant liquid from her mug. "At least have some cookies. They're delicious." "Don't worry," the man said, glancing at her. "Thank you. I'm not hungry." "Tell me more about my father," Pavel shrugged, gloomy, a little withdrawn, but very good. "In fact, he taught me a lot, and I'm happy that he was in my life." Tanya chuckled. "Happy for you," she muttered. The man looked at her in surprise and asked, "It's like you're angry at me, or at him, or at life in general." "I'm right." "You imagined it," Tanya answered, wanting to somehow rectify the situation. She explained, "Sorry, it's just that today is not the best day of my life." When Tanya said these words, tears welled up in her eyes. The woman was afraid that she was about to burst into tears and tried to pull herself together. But she failed, especially when the man sitting opposite happily asked, "What happened between you? Maybe I can help you somehow?" "You?" Tanya chuckled hysterically. "You certainly can't help me." "Why do you think so?" Pavel asked slyly. Because the woman covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. She burst into tears in front of a complete stranger, being alone with him in the house of her father, whom, one could say, she never knew. Pavel didn't bother her with consolation. He simply poured more tea into her mug and waited for the heiress of the house to calm down at least a little. "Forgive," Tanya said, sniffling, when the sobbing died down a little. To somehow explain her hysteria, she, without looking at Pavel, said, "You see, right before I got on the bus at the station, I saw my husband in the company of another woman." "Your husband?" Pavel asked again. "Yes, when I left home, he wasn't going anywhere. But it turns out that as soon as I stepped out the door, he drove to her. I don't know who she is, but apparently they have an affair. I saw them leave the store together and get into Andrew's car. And after that, my husband kissed that woman. I, like a doll, stood there and watched it all, and then I drove here." Large tears rolled down the woman's cheeks, and then Pavel carefully took her hand. "Come on, I'll show you something." "What?" Tanya was taken aback, looking at him with fear. "Nothing special, just something your father was interested in." The woman hesitated for a moment, but then rose from her seat and followed him. They walked down a long, narrow corridor and entered through an inner door. A small utility room. A large workbench stood out among the various tools and junk, taking up the entire space along one wall. The huge table was littered with scraps of wood and shavings, and among them, Tanya spotted small, flat, whimsical figurines of birds and flowers, clearly handcrafted. Then, touched, she noticed another tiny wooden table and a couple of chairs lying next to it. Picking up one of the toy chairs, Tanya asked, "What is this?" Pavel smiled at her. "Your father was a master woodcarver and sometimes made truly amazing things. None of his finished works remain here, only blanks. But I'll show you a photo now, it will make it clearer." The man handed Tanya his phone, and she saw a picture of the most incredible dollhouse in the world. It looked so simple, a true work of art. Fascinated, scrolling through the pictures, the woman completely forgot where she was. Her tears had completely dried up. Tanya seemed to have forgotten that she had just been sobbing at the living room table. "Did your father do all this himself?" she asked in surprise, handing back the phone. To the owner. "Not for sale. It was more of a hobby. This house, for example, was donated to Uncle Vitya, a children's boarding school in the village of Sosnovaya." Tanya couldn't help but smile when she heard his words. "It's very beautiful," she said. Her thoughts turned to her father. In fact, for the first time in her life, Tanya wanted to see him, and at least just talk to him. I'm sorry that you and your father never got to know each other, Pavel said, as if he had guessed what she was thinking. Pavel, I would like to discuss with you the issue of inheriting this house. I don't think I have anything to do with it, and it would be much wiser to transfer the house to you, Tanya said seriously. The man's gaze lingered on her face then, shaking his head in disbelief, said, Are you surprising me? It's not often these days that you meet someone who refuses real estate, no matter what it is. But I think we've already discussed this issue on the phone. Firstly, Tanya, I live in this same village, and I have my own house. Secondly, I'm a lonely man, a widower, and I have no one to pass on even what I have myself. Well, and thirdly, Uncle Vitya, like me, I understand, there's also a grandson, your son. You can make him your heir, since you personally don't need this house. I'm sure Uncle Vitya wouldn't mind. And as for your husband, Tatiana's interlocutor suddenly changed the subject. If it really turns out he has a mistress, she'll dump him for good. Life is too short to waste it on those who don't love us. What makes you think Andrei doesn't love me anymore? Tanya exclaimed in fear, amazed at Pavel's bluntness. If a man lies to you and hugs another woman on the street, it means one thing, that he's fallen out of love with you. I also lied to him today. I didn't want to tell him about my father's inheritance yet, and said I'd gone to see our son. Really? So your husband doesn't know you're here, alone with me? A glimmer of laughter flashed in the man's eyes. Quite unexpectedly, he leaned toward Tanya. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Tanya didn't even have time to panic or move away from him. The woman involuntarily grabbed the edge of the tabletop and immediately cried out in pain, splintering her palm. What was going on? Pavel tried to take her hand, but Tanya was there. She pulled her back. Nothing. Are you crazy? Or are you insane? I just wanted you to get revenge on your husband, but also to distract yourself from your sad thoughts. A sly smile hung on Pavel's lips. Don't be afraid. I won't touch you anymore. And give me your hand already. Tanya reluctantly held out her hand to him. Oh, but for what it's worth. Pavel whistled. Let's go inside. We'll smear you with brilliant green and bring it out into the light. While Pavel was pulling the splinter out of her hand, Tanya looked at him sideways and thought, how much his late wife must have suffered if he's ready to flirt with the first woman he meets even under such inappropriate circumstances. What are you thinking about? The man asked, as if intruding into her thoughts again. About male polygamy, Tanya answered. Pavel grinned. You think all men are polygamous? I have to admit it. Admit it. Have you cheated on your wife? Tanya was startled by the question. For a split second, the man's eyes narrowed, and he froze, holding the bottle of brilliant green. However, immediately regaining his composure, Pavel carefully dabbed the wound on Tanya's hand with the dark liquid and, without looking her in the eye, said, I didn't have time to cool toward my wife, and therefore remained faithful to her until her death. But don't rush to erect a mental monument to me. My wife and I are the exact opposite. How so? Tanya asked cautiously. That's how it is. I accidentally found out that my Oksana was dating one of the drivers at the plant where we all worked. Naturally, I gave her a scandal, and my wife up and left for her lover. A week later, they crashed, hitting an oncoming truck on the highway. For a long time, I couldn't even talk about it. You're probably the first person I've told this story to so calmly. Although there wasn't really anyone to talk to. All my friends already know how it all happened. The village is small, you can't hide anything from anyone. Forgive me for reminding you about this, Tanya said out loud, mentally scolding herself. Then, looking at her palm, she said thank you and for trying to distract me from my troubles too. Okay, maybe we should discuss some matters related to this house and in general? She asked. Yes, Pavel nodded. Let's go into the room, I'll give you all the documents and tell you what you need to know. What will happen next? Tatiana returned home much more collected than she had been on her way to the village. She was determined to talk to her husband that very day and demand an answer. Who was the woman sitting in his car, and what was going on? It was a shame, of course, that she hadn't approached the couple and immediately started a showdown with her husband. But nothing could be done now. She would probably have to listen to his lies or something similar, but in any case, Tatiana wasn't about to let things slide and bury her head in the sand, as she had done before. She herself didn't know what exactly had affected her so. The very fact of what she had witnessed with her own eyes, or the unusual meeting with an unusual man, so similar to her favorite actor. Remembering Pavel, Tanya couldn't help but smile. He truly was something extraordinary, unlike anyone she knew. As if he were out of this world, Tanya thought. But that's exactly what she liked about him. And it was his unusual behavior that helped her cope. As they approached the city, her purse rang. Phone. Tanya pulled out the device and saw that her son was calling. Yes, Antoshka, hi, she answered. Mom, where are you? I can't get through to you. I was out of town and now I'm returning home. I don't know, maybe the connection is lost on the road. Something happened, Tanya remembered, realizing that her son's voice was somehow agitated. Dad. He was in an accident, Anton said into the phone. How so? What kind of accident? On the ring road, not far from the house. Several cars collided there at once. Tanya covered her mouth with her hand. How is he, Antoshka? She asked in a quiet voice. I don't know while I'm on my way to the hospital. Will you be able to come there too? Yes, of course. I'll take a taxi straight from the bus station. And where did you go? I didn't understand. Her son asked Tanya. I'll tell you everything later, Antosha. Later. Okay. Then I'll see you at the hospital. My father was taken to the 3rd hospital. Go there. Fortunately, Tanya's husband wasn't seriously injured in the accident, but he still had to spend some time in the hospital. While Tanya was still getting to the hospital after her son's call, she managed to convince she knew that everything had happened for a reason. She'd barely even decided to talk to Andrei when something bad happened to him. It was impossible not to connect the two events. And she convinced herself that everything that had happened was an act of fate. Whatever happened, she and her husband had lived together for an eternity. Everything else was nothing compared to that. Even the stranger who nearly destroyed their family. Besides, Tanya couldn't even imagine life without Andrei. Naturally, Tanya's main priority was helping her husband recover quickly. She cooked broths and steamed cutlets from select meats, made fruit drinks from fresh berries, and brewed kissels. She went to the hospital twice a day. She never even considered talking to Andrei about the day he was hospitalized. Tanya didn't even ask her husband where he was coming from when the accident happened. In the evenings, the woman dreaded what would happen if her husband suddenly died. She also pondered what that failed conversation between them could have led to. Most likely, after Tanya began asking Andrei who the woman was, her husband would simply leave the house. These thoughts sent shivers down the woman's spine, and she was even a little glad that her husband had been hospitalized. One day, Tanya managed to get time off work to visit her husband in the hospital. She dropped by in the morning, brought everything she needed, and told Andrei that she wouldn't be able to see him again that day. However, later that evening, Tanya was finally let off early. After buying some fruit and picking up the medication Andrei's doctor had mentioned that morning, she rushed to the hospital. As she walked down the hallway, she encountered Andrei's neighbor in the ward. After greeting Tanya, the man gave her a strange look, but Tanya didn't pay any attention to it at the time. The door to her husband's room was ajar, and a woman's laughter could be heard coming from within. Tanya stopped dead in her tracks. Not daring to enter, she began eavesdropping on the conversation going on inside. "I'm so tired of lying around here you can't imagine," Tanya heard Andrew say. "Of course, when you have to eat all the crap your chicken cooks, and she'll give you some kind of broth again. Did you cook it or something? You'll soon be crowing over it," a female voice laughed. "Don't even talk about it. It's making me sick. I want shawarma, but she keeps repeating it. The doctor won't let me. The doctor won't let me. Ugh, the woman's got it again. Eat, give me your shawarma while the doctor and wife aren't looking." "Len, I've missed you terribly. It's a shame the neighbor only went out for a little while and will be back soon, otherwise I would have heard another chuckle," and then Andrew said, "Wait. Len, there's my neighbor calling." "Oh, Kolia, are you forgetting something?" Andrew chuckled, then spoke fearfully. "What are you so sure about?" "Got it, thanks Kolia." Apparently, having finished talking on the phone, Andrew spoke in a muffled voice. "Len, the neighbor in the ward said that he'd just met my wife in the hallway." "What do you mean? She wasn't going to see you today. How should I know? Maybe she managed to get time off from work?" "Got it. Come on then, my dear. Ciao. I'll run before your crocodile shows up here. Get well soon, my cat." Tanya jumped away from the door and darted in the opposite direction from the exit. She rounded the corner of the hospital ward and heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. Unable to resist, the woman peeked out from her hiding place. And even though Andre's visitor's face only flashed before she turned toward the elevator, Tanya immediately recognized her. Leaning against the wall, Tatiana closed her eyes. Who was she trying to fool? What was she hiding from? It was already happening. And turning a blind eye to the fact that her husband had taken in mistress wouldn't change that fact. Tanya hunched her shoulders and, without entering her husband's room, wandered downstairs. As she was leaving the hospital, she received a call from Pavel. She stared at the screen in bewilderment, trying to understand why he was calling her, especially now, at this very moment. At this very moment, when she so desperately needed his support. "Hello?" Tanya cried into the phone. She couldn't hold back her tears, as Pavel was the only one who knew about her problems and Andre's supposed infidelity. "Are you crying again? What happened? I just saw them together again, my husband and that woman." "What? Isn't your husband in the hospital now?" "She came to visit him in the room, and I happened to be there and overheard their conversation." "I see. You know what? You want to go for a ride." "Where?" Tanya asked, surprised. "It doesn't matter where. Just take a ride, be on the road. Sometimes the road helps you take your mind off everything. I'm in the city right now, or rather already on the highway, but I can come back for you." "I don't know, that's stupid." "And you don't like doing stupid things?" Without waiting for her answer, Pavel asked, "Where should I pick you up?" 40 minutes later, Tanya was sitting next to Pavel in his car, enjoying the cool breeze that blew in through the open window. At another time, she would probably have been a little surprised by the fact that Pavel's car was quite expensive, but now she simply enjoyed sitting in the comfortable leather seat and, completely lost in thought, watching the night lights flash by. Pavel didn't ask her anything, and they drove mostly in silence. The silence was broken only by the sounds coming from the street and the calm music pouring from the speakers. Tanya had long since lost track of time, and only when the stars began to light up in the sky did she ask, "Perhaps it's time for you to go home. It's a long way to the village." He glanced at her briefly and, after a short silence, answered with a question. "Question. Maybe you could give me shelter in your apartment for tonight? I promise I'll behave decently. I still have business in the city tomorrow, so I'd have to run back and forth, and now only the cat is waiting for me at home. But this stray will find something to feed himself with. Tanya looked at him point blank. "Are you serious?" she asked. "What's the matter? You and I are almost relatives, you could say. Half brother and sister. And relatives sometimes visit each other." The woman blinked her eyes, not knowing what to answer. She couldn't bring home a barely familiar person, a man, especially in the absence of her husband. Or could she? Perhaps today's incident at the hospital made her completely free in her own decisions. Why not? The woman said out loud and smiled weakly, watching the sparkling sparks light up in the man's eyes again. Nothing that could torment Tanya's conscience happened that night. She made Pavlo's bed in her son's former room, and then, despite the fact that they both had to get up early in the morning, they sat in the kitchen until dawn. Twice they brewed tea in a glass teapot, shared their life stories, and switched to informal conversation. And somehow, miraculously, Tatiana managed to calm down completely again. She even stopped by the hospital to visit her husband before work, out of habit, bringing him hot Serniki. No matter what Andre's visitor yesterday said, proper nutrition is by no means an insignificant factor in his condition. At least, that's what Andre's doctor says. And Tanya is used to listening to the opinions of specialists. Her husband was alone in the room, and as soon as Tanya unloaded the groceries on his nightstand, he asked, "Did you come to the hospital last night?" "No." Tanya lied. "I see. Then Kolya was just imagining things." "Yes, Andre. I can't come this evening either," Tanya said, not looking at her husband. "Natasha's called in sick at work, and there's no one to cover for me." "No problem. I'll probably be discharged soon, so there's no need to come here so often," Tanya's husband replied. The woman glanced at him quickly and nodded. Nothing in her appearance or facial expression betrayed the mental anguish she'd been through the previous day, which had been caused by what she'd overheard. Conversation, while her husband was in the hospital, they wouldn't be able to sort things out. So Tanya decided to postpone all conversations with Andre until he had fully recovered and returned to his normal life. Meanwhile, she began to process the inheritance, and Pavel assisted her with everything. They called each other quite often during those days, sometimes spending hours on the phone. Strangely enough, Tanya sometimes caught herself thinking that someone she'd only recently known completely had now become closer to her than many others. Tanya attributed this to Pasha's ability to listen like no one else. And this isn't a trait everyone possesses. For example, Tanya couldn't discuss her current problems with any of her relatives, friends, or even co-workers. Firstly, she was afraid people would start gossiping about them. And secondly, no one but Pavel could help her cope with herself and cope with what was happening in her life. The last straw when she decided not to take drastic measures was the day when her husband called her and said that he was being discharged the next morning. "So don't come to my place today. There's already a ton of groceries left. I don't know where to put them," he said into Andre's phone and quickly added, "And you don't need to pick me up. I'll take a taxi home." "Okay," Tanya answered shortly. To be honest, her mood immediately soured. She didn't want to be in the same apartment with Andre. And Tanya was also afraid that as soon as her husband crossed the threshold, she would no longer be able to restrain herself and would make a scandal for him right on the day of his return from the hospital. Why Tanya, despite Andre's request, went to the hospital that day, she herself did not know. As if she wanted to take some of her husband's things so that he would not have to drag heavy bags. Andre was not in the ward, and neither were his things. Her husband's neighbor Nikolai Vasilyevich, half sitting on his bed by the window, looked at her with fear. And where did Tanya begin? Nikolai Vasilyevich blinked a couple of times, and then waved his hand and said passionately to Nechka, "How can I feel sorry for you?" Tanya narrowed her eyes. "Why?" she asked, already anticipating the answer. "Yes, because Andreyuka is deceiving you. That's his today. They discharged him, and he left 2 hours ago." "Okay." And where did he go? Do you happen to know? I can guess, the man said sullenly, then, catching himself, said, Listen, he called a taxi from my phone. I'll tell you the address now. You, Tanya, are such a good woman. The most caring wife I've ever seen. This can't be done to you. Absolutely not. Nikolai Vasilievich rummaged through his phone and gave the address to which Tanya's husband had gone. Thank you, Tanya muttered, and, on stiff legs, headed for the exit. A heavy sigh was heard from behind, and Tanya, stopping, looked back. Nikolai Vasilievich, don't worry. I already know about my husband's adventures abroad. So consider that you didn't tell me anything. Okay. Tanachka, I don't care about that. I tried to convey to Andrei what he was ready to trade his wife for, and most importantly, for whom? Some kind of whistle, not a woman, although not young anymore. The man waved his hand again, and Tanya, smiling sadly at him, left the room. An unknown force, continuing to control her, made her call a taxi and go the address Andrei's neighbor had given her. Curiously, the house her husband had gone to was located very close to the bus station. That's why Tanya ran into them that day, she guessed. She hadn't thought about what she would do once she got there, knowing only the house number. However, perhaps by some strange act of foreshadowing, she saw her husband's familiar figure sitting on a bench in front of the middle entrance. That same woman, Lena, was hovering around him. Only now did Tanya get a good look at her. Her dyed black hair had a blue tint. The overly bright makeup looked unnatural on her already aging face. Tanya couldn't guess her rival's age, but even setting aside her personal dislike, she couldn't help but admit that the woman looked no better than herself. At least, no younger. And, incidentally, not a bit slimmer. Sorry, we're in the wrong place, the taxi driver asked, watching Tanya hesitate as she left the car. No, I'm sorry, could you take me to the bus station? It's very close, but the driver shrugged and started the engine. Yes, I'll take everything. In the same direction, he muttered under his breath. Tanya was once again running from herself and the obsessive visions that stood right before her eyes. This time her soul was so disgusted that she wanted nothing more than to hide somewhere, to take refuge. And the only place that came to mind was her father's house, which one could say already belonged to her. Tanya got on the bus and arrived in the village. She walked along a familiar road, and although she really wanted to, she didn't dare call Pasha so as not to disturb him. She had enough of him consoling her every time she encountered evidence of her husband's infidelity. She needed to learn to cope on her own. And Pasha wouldn't help her put an end to her relationship with Andrei. A familiar car was parked in front of her father's house, and Tanya froze in place. For some reason, it hadn't occurred to her that Pasha might be here. She looked at her watch. Perhaps if she went back now, she'd still make it on the same bus. The desire to hide in her father's house, where nothing would remind her of her husband, hadn't disappeared. But Tanya was simply ashamed to unload her feelings on Pavel again. Problems and retelling him everything that had happened again today. The phone rang loudly in her bag, and Tanya jumped in surprise when she saw who was calling. The woman frowned. She didn't pick up the phone, but resolutely headed for the house. Pavel was just coming out the door, and when he saw Tanya, he smiled. What a surprise. How did you end up here? I came to check out my new possessions, Tanya answered with displeasure. Pasha raised his eyebrows. Yeah, so you just came. And what do you want from me? It feels like you're watching me and know about everything that happens to me, and then you rush to lend a shoulder. The man looked at her in bewilderment. What had he done again? Who? Your husband, of course. You're not yourself after his antics. Tanya sighed heavily, realizing he was right. The only thing was that she had come to the village for some reason at night. She was already talking about something. He's with her now, the woman said reluctantly. What do you mean not in the hospital? No, he lied to me that he wasn't being discharged until tomorrow, and then he went to see her. Okay, Tanya. You know. Pasha fell silent for a moment, as if he paused, thinking about what he wanted to say. Then, clearing his throat, he spoke of something else. I called you to ask permission to pick up something from Uncle Vitya's garage. I want to try making a dollhouse. Your father, back when he was still alive, promised a family with a sick girl that he would give her his creation. But he never got around to it. Are there any dollhouses left? You saw them in the garage yourself, so what do you say? Will you let me take these dollhouses? Of course. Take whatever you need, Pasha, the woman said, her voice trembling. How did he manage to make her problems seem like the most insignificant things in the world in an instant? A dollhouse for a sick girl. My God, she would have been happy to kiss Pasha for deciding to finish what her father started. And you know what's going on with your husband, Tanya? Divorce him and be done with it. He's not worth your troubles, Pasha said, looking sternly at her. You're absolutely right. Tanya nodded confidently. If I catch the bus, I'll pack his suitcase today and let him roll to that whistle of his. What whistle? He chuckled cheerfully. Pavel. Yes, that's what Andrei's roommate called her. Apparently, he had a chance to talk to her. Good. I like this attitude of yours much better. Will you help me gather everything we find to build a dollhouse? We'll drop this stuff off at my place, and then I'll personally take you to the city to pack your husband's suitcases before you change your mind. Tanya was visiting Pavel for the first time. The house, both outside and inside, looked simply gorgeous, and the woman looked around in bewilderment. Do you like my place? Pavel asked with a laugh. Tanya shrugged, not wanting to betray her impression of what she saw. Don't worry, it's all earned honestly, the man said, and explained. When our mill, which had supplied the country with lumber for over half a century, finally fell apart, I managed to buy some equipment and started my own business. Oddly enough, it turned out to be a good investment, and still brings me a steady income. So, Tanya, marry me. I'm a rich groom. As soon as you divorce your husband, of course. Tanya wanted to get angry, but looking at the sparkle in his eyes, for some reason, she laughed. I'll just go and agree. It would be stupid of me to let such a groom go. After that, they were driving along the night highway again, and Tanya was thinking about how good she felt now. Good, but what could make her feel good in her situation? She didn't want to think about it. The next day arrived. It was Saturday, and Tanya didn't have to go to work. The woman got up at dawn, cleaned the entire apartment, and even washed the windows. Andrei showed up closer to lunchtime. He arrived by taxi as promised. Tanya just saw through the window how her husband was getting out of the car, loaded down with bags. Wow, I'm finally home, Andrei exclaimed from the doorway. Tanya went out into the hallway to greet him. Looking into her husband's shining eyes, the woman crossed her arms and said sarcastically, You could have come yesterday, since you were so homesick. What are you talking about? Andrei was taken aback. I was at the hospital yesterday, but you were already gone, Tanya shrugged. Why did you come to the hospital? I told you I didn't need anything. I'm fed up with your overprotectiveness. Are you going to watch my every move? Andrei dropped the bags in the hallway, and he locked himself in the bathroom. He stayed there for about half an hour, and Tanya heard her husband talking to someone on the phone. When Andrei came out of the bathroom with wet, tousled hair and a towel around his neck, Tanya was still waiting for him in the hallway. What are you standing here for? What kind of meeting is this anyway? I haven't been home for almost a month. You immediately started some kind of interrogation for me. I haven't done anything to you yet. I didn't even ask where you spent last night, the woman said calmly. Where? Where? Who knows where? Andre answered mysteriously, not knowing what else to say. So you don't want to answer my question? Yes, I don't want to, the man flared up. I want to rest. Why are you bothering me? You won't be able to rest. What is this? Why? Because we have a serious conversation ahead of us, and, unfortunately, we can't avoid it. Tanya, are you normal? I just came from the hospital. Not just then. Go to hell. I've had enough of your suspicions, as if we were both 30 years old. I have nothing better to do than make excuses to you. You're no longer in that position. Understand? What position am I in? The woman frowned. Look in the mirror and check your passport. And you'll understand, men don't stand in line for people like you. Tatiana smirked. Of course. How could she have confidence in herself when her own husband thought she was old and unattractive? That's why she started to feel insecure about the natural age-related changes in her body. And this had been going on for several years, during which her husband had repeatedly hinted at, and sometimes even directly told her, about these very changes. That's when Tanya began to feel ashamed of herself, hiding her figure under loose robes, afraid to get a new hairstyle in case it would make her look even older, and so on down the list. Why do you continue to live with me if everything is so bad? Tanya asked, looking at her husband. Because we're supposedly married, Andre said, raising his finger. So it seems. Don't quibble with words. It's your fault that you arranged such a meeting with me today and thereby completely pissed me off. And I didn't want to quarrel with you at all. I'm not arguing with you, Andre. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the truth. It seems to me that living with it's a bit stupid to treat someone just because of a stamp in their passport. What's stupid? I don't understand you at all. What are you hinting at? I'm not hinting. I'm being direct. Why live together if you don't want to anymore? Do you want to divorce me because I didn't come home last night? Is that it? It's not about last night. It's just that our relationship has run its course. These words completely infuriated Andre. He stared at Tanya and, drooling, said, "The relationship has run its course." Yes, if you want to know, that's really true. I fell out of love with you a long time ago and don't feel anything for you at all. Good, then I was right. The only thing I don't understand is why you continued to pretend that everything was fine and lived next to someone you didn't love. Everyone lives like that. Do you think love is something eternal? Nothing is eternal. Love comes in different forms, Andre. At the beginning of a relationship, it can be hot and passionate, and over the years, it can become tender and warm. At least, until recently, that's exactly how I felt for you. I did. So, has something changed now? Andre looked triumphantly at his wife. He was probably pleased to know that she still loves him. But Tanya looked at her husband with a smile and said quite calmly, "Everything has changed. Absolutely everything. Your suitcase is packed in the bedroom, and I hope we can get by without further explanations. Everything is already perfectly clear. I didn't understand what suitcase. Do you want me to leave?" "Yes, I really want that," Tanya said confidently. "What a turn of events," the man cried. "I was going home to my wife, but it turns out I have no wife, no home." Andre rushed into the bedroom and, freezing for a while, looked at the suitcase that was indeed standing in the middle of the room. Completely angry about this, he shouted somewhere inside the apartment, "And you won't regret this later?" "And don't doubt it, I won't," came his wife's instant response. The man nervously grabbed the suitcase and headed for the exit. Right near the door, he turned around, but seeing his wife's smiling face, he didn't say another word and walked out the door. Andre went downstairs down in the elevator, and near the exit from the entrance I ran into an old woman neighbor who lived in the apartment below them. "Hello, Andreyusha," she greeted and glancing sideways at the large suitcase set in her arms, asked, "Are you going somewhere?" The wife threw her out of the house angrily. The man muttered in response, "What are you talking about?" Gasping, exclaimed the old woman. "That's why, I see, while you were lying in the hospital, your Tanya relaxed." "How relaxed?" "What are you talking about?" Andre didn't understand. A man brought her home, and even stayed overnight. The old woman spoke willingly. "What kind of man? What are you saying?" Andre immediately wilted and looked at his neighbor with fear. Yes, he has a big black car, no doubt some kind of bandit. I didn't sleep then all night until he left Tanya in the morning." "Maybe you got it wrong, what?" "It wasn't Tanya that man brought." "But someone else?" Andre asked doomedly. "No, for some reason I would confuse Tanya with someone else. We've lived in the same house for so many years, and yesterday she arrived in the same car. Then again, I was out on a spree almost all night, so it's your Tanya." "Oh, what a disaster, Andre." The neighbor shook her head and said thoughtfully, "Now I don't know how to get her back to you. Look at her." "What's she like?" Andre asked somewhat plaintively. "She's a sight to behold." The old woman stated authoritatively and explained, "She always looks good. I've never seen her even go out into the street untidy, and in general she's a good woman. I know her. That guy, apparently, grabbed her. And the guy, let me tell you, is also quite respectable. He looks like some actor. I just can't remember what movie I saw him in." Andre still couldn't believe the elderly neighbor's words, and everything that was happening seemed like a dream to him. Leaving the entrance, he decided to call his son and complain about what was happening. "Anton, when was the last time you saw your mother?" he asked. "The day before yesterday we went to the notary together. We drew up the documents for the house. What's wrong? Mom called yesterday and said that you were being discharged today, but you didn't tell me to meet you. Something happened? Should I come pick you up at the hospital?" "No, I'm already home." "Well, not quite home." "Wait, Anton, what house is this? What are we even talking about?" "So, Grandpa Victor's house. Our mother's father? He left her the house as an inheritance. Don't you know anything?" "No," Anton's father said dejectedly. "It seems there's a lot I don't know." Andre said goodbye to his son and, raising his head, looked up at the windows of their apartment. He wanted nothing more than to go back and interrogate his wife, but he understood perfectly well that she hadn't packed his things for nothing. She must have somehow found out about his relationship with Lena. So she decided to take revenge. No problem, Andre thought. She'll live alone for a while and come to her senses. She'll even ask me to come back. Andre tried not to think about what the neighbor had said and about some guy in an expensive car. It couldn't be true. That's all there was to it. Several months passed, during which Andre tried with all his might to get his relationship with his wife back on track. At first, he thought it would be easy. All he had to do was repent to her, confess, and then ask for forgiveness, and swear it would never happen again. With great difficulty, swallowing his pride, the man did just that. But it didn't help. Tanya listened calmly, said she forgave him, and nothing changed for him. Andre tried everything after that. He really did break off all relations with Lena. He suddenly became disgusted with her. He brought Tanya flowers by the armful, sparing no expense even for the most expensive roses. He tried to convey to his wife that his words about him falling out of love with her were a lie, and that he'd said it only to anger her. One day, completely despairing of reclaiming his life, Andre nearly burst into tears in front of his wife, but even seeing his genuine remorse, Tatiana merely told him she couldn't help herself. Her warm love for him had completely faded, and the new feelings that had flared within her were too strong. She was the one talking about her feelings for that very man, who turned out to be a real person, not a figment of her neighbor's imagination. His name was Pavel, and he was Tanya's father's ward. They met when he told her of her father's death and the house she had inherited. In the end, Andrei had to accept that the old woman next door was right, and he really would never get his wife back. After the divorce, they sold their apartment, where they had been so happy as Andrei now believed, and divided the proceeds 3 ways. His wife, now ex-wife, as far as Andrei knew, she gave her share to their son, and Anton bought himself a new studio apartment not far from his work. Tanya herself now lived outside the city, and Andrei angrily imagined her new life in the luxurious house of his lousy actor. It seemed as if nothing good in life awaited Andrei anymore. He dreamed only of his wife bringing him hot lunches and breakfasts again, and all the men in the department would look at him with envy again, and his wife's love for him would never fade.